good morning, everybody. This is Chattin with CHAP, and I am your host, Ginger Wade, and I have a special guest with me today, and she is an amazing woman who has an amazing story about homeschooling to share with you, and I think you need to hear about it because we did just celebrate Independence Day, which is a very important holiday for our nation, and we're going to talk about homeschool freedom today because y'all need to hear about it because I don't know how much we think about it. So I'm hoping that her story is going to light a little bit of a fire under you and make you realize what it takes. Just like our nation, our freedom isn't free, neither is homeschool freedom. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. And you're going to have to forgive me, Zan, because whenever I say your name, I've got to say it like you say it. It's Zan Tyler. And I love it. And it's an endearing thing to me. I love accents. I love speaking with accents. So when I do it, it's because I love you.
Well, thank you. Some people do it and they're mocking. So
No, not at all. I love it. I think it's
appreciate
amazing.
the person who loves me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Zan. I don't know how many people in the CHAP audience knows you. I mean, if we listen to Heidi, we've heard you on Heidi a few times and some other places and stuff. And of course you have your own podcast, but if they're not connected with you, tell them a little about yourself.
Okay, I'd love to. Well, actually, Joe and I lived in Pennsylvania for a year. We lived in right outside of Abington, Philadelphia area, and our second son was actually born there. So you would have thought maybe I picked up a little bit of the accent, but I guess not.
No, you didn't spend enough time above the line.
So Joe and I have three kids. We started homeschooling in 1984. Now we have 8 grandkids, which is fabulous, glorious. We love that. I tell my kids now, I just thought I loved you.
That's so funny. I didn't get to that stage yet, so I'm waiting.
Yes, I know. I was the type, once my kids grew up, I just was not in a hurry to have grandkids because we had homeschooled for 21 years. I was enjoying them being adults and I wasn't teaching them. I mean, not that I didn't love homeschooling, but it was just it was a fun relationship. And oh my word, when that first grandbaby was born several years later, I was smitten. And anyway, so so now, do you want me to tell my story or just,
Well, I would love them to hear a little bit. I know, and I'm afraid we don't have time probably for all of it.
Yes.
We are going to touch on points of it, but yeah, I would love for them, like, how did you get into it and what did that look like? Because like you said 1984, right? Was that, I mean,
oh, my word. I mean, it was very George Orwellian if you're into literature. And it was in 1984. I didn't know anybody in the world who homeschooled. I mean, it was the only time I'd heard the word homeschool. It was a group in Mississippi that bartered. They didn't use money. They lived in the woods.
Wow.
So that was really, and I was like, must have been a newscast or something where I heard that. So I had my oldest son was in kindergarten. We lived in Philly for a year, and then we lived in Andover, Massachusetts for a year. And when we came back, we settled in the school district I had gone to, which was an excellent public school district. But Ty was in a church kindergarten, our oldest, and he was the only one in the kindergarten not reading. 8 maybe 6 or 8 kids. And when I was in college, there were 2 things I said I would never do: teach or have kids. And I was very committed to going on to law school. And that had just, I had been preparing for that, some type of graduate school all of my life because I mean, I was a believer, but I never really thought about Christian womanhood either. And so Joe proposed to me our junior year. We got married right after college. I had a baby 9 months later. And so Ty is having problems with reading. And since I had been terribly committed to not knowing anything about education, I just didn't know what to do because I was a good student. Well, Ty ended up being a good student too. But, so a friend of mine said, Zan, you just need to hold Ty back a year. She had her master's in early childhood education. She said, little boys just need a year sometimes. And if this happened to me now, knowing what I know now, this would have been no big deal at all. But then it was this huge deal. So we had him tested and in the meantime, a good friend of mine that I used to meet together with a Bible study and prayer once a week, they were getting ready, they were getting their masters and getting ready to go to Kenya on the mission field. She was a little bit older, and she said, Zan, I taught in public schools. I'm going to homeschool Nat. And I will never forget, oh my word, Ginger, when she said that, you know the scene in Star Wars where the four heroes are in the trash compactor and the walls are closing in, and I was in their little mobile home that they lived in for married student, housing. And I thought, Lord, get me out of here. I just want to get out of here. This is the strangest thing I've ever heard. But out of respect to my friend, I read the book, Homegrown Kids, and I was captivated. I mean, I was really captivated. I thought, this is the answer to education.
Mm-hmm.
But I really felt like the Lord was calling me to do that. But the school district had said they'd let me hold tie back a year. And then in June or July of that year, they said, no, just kidding, you can't. And I knew he wasn't ready for first grade. My friend, the associate superintendent of education, who had been my principal in high school, I called him. I said, can you just give me a note? They used to do that all the time, Ginger. He said, I can't, Zan. And I'm thinking, yes, you can. I said,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'll just have to homeschool. And I knew that was kind of my trump card. And he said, oh, well, the district is getting real lenient with that now, Zan. What he meant was, in the history of the district, one person had homeschooled for 1 year and she had had her teaching degree. And so we had to, and now I'm just going to really speed it up. We had to have an attorney. We had to hire an attorney to find out what the homeschooling law was, because the school board nor the state board would give us that information. No Mr. Google, no support groups, no organizations. I think maybe in 83 HSLDA had formed on the West Coast, but it certainly wasn't an outreach, nationwide. But they were just the beginning stages. And so, I mean, I was just stumped. So we hired the attorney. I turned in my application to the school board, which we don't have to do in South Carolina anymore. And but it was like, it was like a master's thesis,
My
36
word.
syllabus, fire escape plan, all the books. How many books do you have in your house? Letters of recommendation from a doctor. It was crazy. So the school district turned me down. So I called my attorney back and I said, so now what do I do? And he said, well, you appeal to the State Department of Education and they will rubber stamp what the school district did and you'll end up in family court. And I'm telling the Lord, I'm arguing with God. And I'm saying, I told you this was a terrible idea. What were you thinking? And so, in the midst of all of this, I remembered that the state superintendent of education was actually, I say, a friend, an acquaintance of my mom. My mother was a great public school teacher. And when Dr. Williams was getting his PhD in education, he observed her classroom for several months. And I was just right across the hall. And I would see him every afternoon for several months. So I called him up and I said, Dr. Williams, this is Zan Tyler, Sybil Peters' daughter. I have a problem. Can I make an appointment with you? He said, oh, listen, I'll clear my calendar this morning. Come on up. I mean, friend. So I went to see him, and this is what I thought was going to happen. I thought he's going to say, Zan, you're a mom who loves your child. You've been done wrong. Let's see what we can do to fix the problem and get Ty in the class he needs to be in. Instead, he looked at me and he said, if you continue down this homeschooling path, I will have you put in jail for truancy. And the scripture is clear that when you come before the authorities, the Holy Spirit will give you the words to speak. What they don't say, what the Bible doesn't say, is you might not like the words. And so it's just Dr. Williams and me in this room. And he says, and I hear somebody saying, well, Dr. Williams, you'll just have to put me in jail then. And I'm looking around, did I really say that? Is there somebody else in this room? But, I know that was the Lord giving me those words. And it was sort of like my Patrick Henry moment, give me liberty or give me death, which I was not expecting to encounter that. We encounter challenges to our freedom when we least expect it. And that's why we need to be prepared for it. And so that just set into effect a whole series of ramifications, a hearing before the state board. I'd actually been politically active in high school and worked for a U.S. senator. And so he flew down from Washington when he found out what was happening. He was going to overnight a letter on my behalf to the state board. He actually flew down and met with Charlie Williams and said, get off her back. And they did. And so we were able to make it through that first hearing. We were just going to homeschool Ty 1 year to get him ready. That first year was horrible circumstantially. We lived in this little cul-de-sac neighborhood, but every day or every other day, there was always a policeman riding by our house. I'd never seen a policeman before in our neighborhood, presumably to make sure we were homeschooling. The kids were in the house and my car was there and those types of things. So, we had neighbors and friends, family, church members who wouldn't speak to us. This is, if I could paint the picture of homeschooling in 1984, where people didn't know what it was and it was an affront to everybody and a slap in the face to it was, oh, our schools aren't good enough. We're not, it was, it was really just sort of horrible. But what was happening in our home, and I had been a stay-at-home mom, the boys had been in preschool and kindergarten. It was phenomenal. And so I told Joe, I want to do this 1 more year. And Joe is such a homeschool fanatic now. But he looked at me and he said, yeah, I was kind of afraid of that. He never reluctant homeschool dad in the beginning. Uh, and so it was in that year that we got a knock on the door. And really, every time I got a knock on the door late at night, and Joe traveled a lot, but he happened to be home this night, I thought, is this DSS coming to get my kids? I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so it was a neighbor of ours who actually hated homeschooling. But he said, Zan, I'm here to tell you, you know how I feel about homeschooling, but we love you guys. And I'm the head of a state agency. And if you are familiar with the state register says that a state agency can promulgate regulations and it never has to be passed by the legislature. If it sits there for, I think it's 90 days, it may be 180, but I think it's 90, it just automatically becomes law. And they were promulgating regulations that would require homeschooling parents to have a college degree from an accredited university and only use state approved texts, which means you could not use any Christian curriculum. And so that is how I ended up getting into the real freedom fight beyond our own homeschooling situation. And so Joe and I, as a family, including that first year when we homeschooled, we spent 8 years either in court or the legislature every year trying to find what they said, a solution to the homeschool problem. And so, I can tell you, homeschool freedom is like any other freedom. If we ignore it, it will go away.
Yeah.
If we don't steward it, we won't have it. And like you said at the beginning of the podcast, freedom is not free.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard your story multiple times, but every time it's just incredible to think back. I listened to the Eaglesons story, too, and they were in 1986 and they decided to homeschool Hannah, their oldest, before there was a law in Pennsylvania. And then they were fortunate, right before they were going to do it, there was a law passed. So they they somehow made it by. But
yes,
every time your story is just like, you went through it. You went through it, and we cannot forget that. And we have to be prepared because there is some scary stuff going on in the nation right now.
Let me tell you, in this last legislative session, I have seen more real threats to homeschool freedom than I have seen maybe in the last 2.5 decades.
Yeah. Yeah. So we feel like we're flying in a safe place, but no, it's like coming around now. It's like the second push, right?
And people say to me, there's so many homeschoolers now, Zan, we don't have to worry about this now. There's safety in numbers. And I'm thinking, no, there is a bigger target in numbers. Mm-hmm. And we're threatening school districts and, schools are closing and since COVID and, this is pretty hardcore.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the parts that I really think about in your story, and this has happened to me personally, which is probably why I connect with it so much, is when you went to the office of the guy and you were like, he's going to support me. This is going to be my backer. Right. And he's like, I'll throw you in jail. And you're like, what? So if we have listeners out there and they want to be involved in supporting homeschooling or they're just trying to homeschool and their family is against it. Like I have a friend whose family is just totally against it. Like, what do you do? Like, what do you do when you go in and that person you thought was going to be your right hand person or your backer, or this person who would be like, yay, you're doing a great thing. When they, I mean, turn on you or don't support you, or whatever the term is that you want to use, like, what do you do then? Like, what did you do? Like you said, there was the Holy Spirit came upon you and you said, throw me in jail. So like, how
You
do
know,
you, what do you go forward? How do you go forward?
I think there are a couple of things. There's a verse in the Bible that talks about David was in a whole heap of trouble. I won't set the stage, but it says he strengthened himself in the Lord. And so I will say, and Charles Spurgeon has this devotion I love, and he talks about, oh, happy hurricane that throws us on the grace of Christ where no other human being in the world can understand or help us. And so I really felt like God was my refuge and my strength. And there were a couple of Bible verses like Hebrews 11:7 and 8. 11:7 is that Noah built an, for, because of his fear of God and things unseen, he was motivated by faith to build an ark for the salvation of his family. And I would think about him for 90 years building that ark plank by plank, being ridiculed and mocked. And somehow the next verse after that says Abraham went out to receive his inheritance, not knowing where he was going. And every day in those, I would wake up and say, Lord, I don't know where I'm going today, where we're going, but I really feel like this is where you have called us. And then the Lord began to send people to me to increase my vision. And it was a calling. I knew it was a calling. And I had this fierce love for my child that said, I am not putting you in a situation that is going to harm you, not physically, but, academically, mentally, socially, spiritually. I am not doing that. And so it was just this thing inside of me like, don't mess with my kid. And it always surprises me in retrospect that wanting to hold one child back had all those unforeseen ramifications. The school district, they cannot or will not. It's not like I was asking them to move heaven and earth, but they're not willing, or they say they're not able to accommodate the needs of individual children. So that's up to us as parents, and so I just love my son. I was going to be John Brown if he was going into first grade when he wasn't ready.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that hard work, I mean, you did all that hard work, and homeschooling itself is hard work. Moms are like, ugh, this is like, you brought them home. I'm sure it wasn't like super awesome flowers and sunshine and
Yeah,
lollipops and every
yeah,
time
yeah,
either, right?
yeah.
So
I,
you're going through all this hard work to bring them home, and then you bring them home, and then you have all this hard work to try to figure it all out. So like, where, is that, where do you go to get that energy? And maybe you've said this already, I guess, because you did say you go to the Lord and you're doing what it is that He's called you to do, and He puts that Holy Spirit inside you. Is there any other, do you have any, like, you probably didn't have community, like you were on your
no,
own.
we.
So
I am
you were,
such an extrovert, Ginger, and
yeah,
I felt like, oh, this is going to sound so melodramatic, but the Apostle John may have been one of the most extroverted of the apostles, and it said he loved people, he loved his people, and then he was exiled to the island of Patmos. And I just read that verse in Revelation so much where it talked about him being exiled. And I would really just weep because I missed people. I I love people. I want to make people happy. I don't mind a I guess I found out I don't mind a fight for righteousness, but I don't, it, probably the best news is no matter what a homeschool mom is going through now, they don't have to do it alone. Find your peeps, find your community, and you can do that. And that will help so much. I think that is what has propelled me throughout my years, the last 40 years in homeschooling now, is just providing support the kind of support I would have given my eye teeth to have. And so, we started a homeschooling organization in 1990, and we started it. We were in court for 2 years over its legality, and finally got it established in state law, which was pretty amazing. And but we had an elementary, we had a high school, and a special needs department, and it was to give people the support that I didn't have. I mean, I love what I'm doing at BJU Press now because we're so active in supporting state homeschooling organizations, and they sponsor my podcast. And so anything I can do to support homeschooling moms, I mean, I just feel like that's what I'm here for to do. And so find your peeps. You do not find your community. You do not have to do this by yourself. And my life would have been totally different if I had had community in those first couple of years. And I'm not and really the time I had with the Lord was so sweet that I wouldn't trade it for anything. But it was like you said, it was really hard on me. It was just hard.
So honestly, I mean, it's rely on the Lord when it feels like everything else is taken away, because He does that for a reason, because He
Yeah,
wants you to
that's right.
rely completely on Him. But then as you were going along with that, how did you, like, you mentioned, the organization SCAYS, and then you have all these other things, like, how did that start happening?
We had our first public hearing in 1986. We were starting to get calls from people, we were hearing murmurs of people who were homeschooling, and I was trying to keep a list on our Tandy 1000. If you want to know the history of technology, go back and look up the Tandy 1000. And so when we had that first when when we got the first news that they wanted to pass that law that said college degrees and only use state approved text, I called our attorney. He said, Zan, the only way to stop it is to call a public hearing, and you've got to have 25 letters that are sent in to stop this hearing. So it is Joe and me and our kids, and I'm trying to find addresses on these people who have sort of contacted me and or don't hate homeschooling or have heard the word homeschooling. And I thought, if I get 25 letters in, this will be a miracle. And so I asked people, oh, just appreciate the technology. I asked people to write a letter, mail it to the state. Of course, there's no email. State Department of Education, gave them the address, and carbon copy me, send me a carbon copy of the letter. And so I just every day I would pray, Lord, just send a letter, just send me 25 letters. And I ended up with 125
What?
letters. I will never understand that as long as I live. So that was enough to stop that. And then at that first public hearing, I don't know where all of a sudden the groundswell came from, because it's just all those early years are just such a blur. But we brought Dr. Moore in as our guest expert. This was before the state board, not before the legislature. And we had hundreds of people there. And, it was really amazing. It was people, that's one of the reasons I won't go into all of this, why I really believe that homeschooling is a revival movement, is because, none of us had social media or ways to communicate with each other. How did you know if somebody was homeschooling? You didn't. And then all of a sudden, all over the country, all these people start homeschooling, and it's not because there's social media telling them about it. I really believe it was Holy Spirit driven, and I can't account for the number of people that showed up, that sent those letters or showed up at that first public hearing. But that was really the seeds. And then I got in contact with people around the state. Some organization in the lower part of the state gave us their 501c3 organization that they didn't want to use anymore. And we took that over, and we had the South Carolina Home Educators Association, and so SKIA. And so I started working as the legislative liaison there, and that list started growing. And, And then it just grew. It just started growing. Certainly not the growth we're seeing today, but when when we started SCAES and that South Carolina Association of Independent Home Schools, because we were trying to find a way for people to not have to go through their public school district anymore. And an attorney, not Mike, but an attorney had sent me a memo and said, Zan, start an organization for homeschoolers and just certify them as private schools. And that was legal in South Carolina, but it didn't work for us. But we started with 120 families. And we were, all the people that were helping me said, you'll have 2 years before you're threatened with jail. I mean, with threatened with lawsuits. I mean, 4 months later, 3 months later, 11 of our members were served truancy charges. And some of it at nighttime with the big flashlights by the sheriff
Oh
deputy
my God.
who wanted to give the notice to the child. I mean, there were some horrible things, but that was 120 families. And then that just, it just, and I can remember we called for 3 days of fasting and prayer before our last hearing at the state legislature. And we had so many things against us. It should have never passed, but it did. And so, it starts little. That verse that says, don't despise the day of small beginnings. And then I just think the Lord has caused the whole thing. I believe it's the blessing of God. There's no other explanation for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious. And I mean, you were small, but you stayed committed to it. You knew that that's what God was calling you to do, and you knew it's what was right, and you stayed to it. And the people you drew in, you also the people showed up at their door, but they didn't go, okay, I give up. Here's my kids. They stayed with it, and you've continued to share your story. I'm sure you've told your story. Like you didn't even think it just comes out because you said it so many times, right? So, like, for our listeners, like, what is the importance of them telling their story to the next person who's terrified to do this homeschooling thing, even though it's legal and it's, accepted? It is more under attack now, but what is the why? Why share your story? Why encourage the next person to do it? Why get involved? Why? Why
Right,
is it
right.
why?
And I do want to say this. We had a board on SKIA and we had a board on SCAES that was terrific. Dr. Jim Carper and his wife, Kathy, and Steve Suits, who was a pediatric surgeon. I mean, we had, by this point, we're finding remarkable people to stand with us. So I don't want to make this sound like this was like a one-man show or something like that, because as time went on, it was just amazing the people the Lord brought into homeschooling and brought to us in particular. And so, but I think stories are important. I mean, I think God works through stories. Why do we have so many stories in the Old Testament? Like, I can't wait to meet Ruth and Naomi and Esther. And I can't wait to meet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who walked through the fiery furnace. And they were like three of my best buds. I can't wait to see them.
Yeah.
And it's just, so I think God works through stories. And so my story is not important if it's just about me, but it's about what God can do and what God can do for you. And it's how he takes ordinary people and gives extraordinary circumstances and opens doors in a way that no human being could. So, I feel like in the last part of my life, that I just want to say out loud what the Lord has done. And what he did for me is not because I was anything special. I mean, when I would go to the legislature, I'm 5 feet tall. They would all call me little lady. And it wasn't an endearing term. And so, well, little lady, you know. And that's when most things were, the legislature was mostly male back in those days. And I think there were like 4 or 5 female lobbyists at the state house at that point. And so, but nothing is impossible for God.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope everyone takes encouragement from that out there. Like, if God is putting on your heart any part of this, just to do the homeschooling thing, or to help with the legislative things, or to support it in other ways in your community, nothing is too hard for God. Don't be afraid of what he's calling you to do, right? Just And he has, your story shows miracle after miracle after miracle. And, you know, the CHAP story, miracle after miracle, and things that have happened over the years. So, yeah, it is quite an amazing thing to see what he will do with a willing heart.
And, you know, I want to say this before we leave the podcast, is that God is not going to punish your children either. You know, it's I have a friend who says that, well, Deb Bell, who is right there in Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
and she says that God will move heaven and earth to open doors to bless our children, which is pretty amazing. And so, you know, like my two boys grew up in at the state house with me. They watched court proceedings. My son got particularly close to Mike Ferris, who was the founder of HSLDA. And you know, it's interesting because both of them ended up working in the state Senate when they were in high school, and John continued during college. And our senator, who sponsored all of our legislation, really encouraged John to go to law school. He had wanted to go to med school, and he did. And so, 2.5 years ago, a new state superintendent of education in South Carolina asked John to become the chief legal counsel for the state superintendent for the State Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was his counterpart, you know, 40 years ago, that was my nemesis, that one of the people who made my life so miserable. And then to see John in this capacity, I mean, John was all the things that I thought were awful for my kids to have to go through. It was like the greatest education God could have given them in preparing them for their lives and their callings. And for me to see this 40-year redemption story, it just, you know, it just makes me weep. And so just hang in there, because and the Bible said those who sow in tears will reap in joy. And, you know, a lot of times as homeschooling moms, it doesn't matter if you're facing any of these legal challenges. That's not really the hard part of homeschooling. The hard part of homeschooling is knowing the buck stops with you, you know, and all that responsibility you bear. And we always think, are we blessing our kids or are we ruining our kids? And all the mental gymnastics we go through as homeschooling. And that's the hard part of homeschooling. And everybody faces that. And so, you know, I just want to encourage you to hang in there, because it's good for I mean, we wouldn't, if it weren't good for our kids, we would never do this.
Yeah. I think it's important too. Like you said, if God is leading you to it, whatever happens with your children in that process, he will use.
Yes, that's
He's
right.
working in a mighty way in your boy's life. I just, that's awesome. That is incredible. And, you know, don't worry about the gaps. There's always gaps. God will fill the gaps the way God needs to fill the gaps.
So this, to me, okay, this is just one of my buttons to push. Gaps in every school system, in every, I don't care who. I can remember I graduated 10th in a class of 601 kids in high school. And I remember sitting the first day in college and realizing I was already behind 650 pages of reading. And I thought, nobody prepared me for this. And I had been in an excellent high school. So, you know, it just, it doesn't matter where you go to school or who your teacher is, there are gaps. It can be the fault of the student. It can be the fault of the teacher. I mean, we're just not perfect human beings, and I can try to teach something that nobody wants to learn. I mean, you know, and that's from the classroom teacher. So
yeah,
so,
yeah.
But
So
God is the gap filler. You're right.
Yes.
I interrupted you.
No, you're totally fine. No, God, he will take care of those guys. I'm glad I pushed your button. So good. So thank you so much for sharing that, though. I think everybody needs to realize the depth of the challenge in getting the freedom to homeschool and the possibilities that are before us to keep that freedom and to keep things moving forward if we are willing to be a part of it, and if we are willing to do the thing, you know, homeschooling our kids and then standing up for homeschool rights and freedoms and stuff like that. So Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we really need to hear that. It's freedom time here. You know, we just celebrated our independence, and so we're freedom minded currently. So I think it was really good to just be reminded that history. We don't study history.
Yeah, that's
So,
right. That's it. You're right. You're right.
yeah,
Whole other podcast that we'll do together.
yeah. How about it? How about it? So everybody out there who's listening, if you would like to be involved to make sure that Pennsylvania homeschooling stays free, stays a possibility, please write into us. You can comment below, staff@chaponline.com if you want to send an email. We're looking for folks who want to read through bills. We're looking for folks who want to talk to legislators, help plan the Capitol Day, any kind of a way. We're building the team. Any way that you would be interested in doing. There's stuff that you can do from home. There's stuff that you can do down at the Capitol. There's all kinds of jobs. So just get involved. And if nothing else, tell other people about your story. Tell them about the importance of standing up for homeschool freedom, and just, keep your ear to the ground, be listening, and yeah, God will bless what you're doing. And I'm so listening to this story today. So thank you, Zan. It's great to have you
Well, thank
here.
you, Ginger. I'm so glad we connected, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
That's wonderful. All right, everybody. Hey, remember, it's July. Take a break, take a vacation, and enjoy following Christ in all of life with your children as you go through and you're listening and you teach your children how to listen for his guidance in your life. So have a great week. I'll see you back in 2. See you later. Bye now.